Okay, we're right on time. Good morning, everyone. Warm welcome to you all, friends and members of Chatham House, both here today and online. Here at Chatham House, we've been convening for over 100 years on the big issues in international affairs, and today we're very happy you're joining us to hear more about the German elections and what the implications might be for European policy and other issues. Generally, German elections haven't been traditionally very exciting or haven't generated a lot of international interest. It's been a bit different this time for various reasons. To introduce myself, my name is Patrick Schroeder. I'm a Senior Research Fellow in the Environment and Society Center. I'm standing in for my colleague Amida van Rij. She leads the Europe program here at Chatham House, but unfortunately she's fallen ill and can't join us. But the credit for organising today's event is all hers. And maybe also some background at the Environment Society Center. We actually quite closely follow German and European economic and trade policy, and we've had engagement over the years with Germany's Ministry for Economic Cooperation and various EU institutions, DG Trade, DG Grow, on sustainable and resilient supply chains. So we're quite keen to learn more about what the German election policy changes might also have implications in that field. Then Chatham House has also broader interests around Germany, for example, Germany's evolving security role in Europe and Ukraine especially, and other topics. And we really have an expert panel today, outstanding experts with deep expertise on these topics, on trade, German economy, security, German domestic politics. So we'll hear from the panel. Before I introduce you all, a couple of housekeeping points. So today's event is on the record, so we're not using the Chatham House rule. You're free to share the information from today's event. If you want to share it online, please use the hashtags #CHEvents and also @Chatham House. I think, yeah, so that's it. We have about 30 minutes with the moderated Q&A with the experts, and then we shift to a Q&A. So there's opportunities for everyone to raise questions. You can stay seated, so the microphone will come to you once you've raised your hand. And for the online participants, you can post your questions through the chat, and we can maybe also answer a couple of questions from the online audience. Now, enough from me. Let me introduce the experts. Let's start with Dr. Tu Nguyen, who's the Deputy Director at the Jacques Delors Center, the Hertie School. She leads the think tank's work on institutional questions of EU policy. In her own work, she mainly focuses on EU institutional reform, the rule of law, democracy, and economic governance. She is also the host of the Jacques Delors Center podcast, EU to Go, their podcast for Europapolitik. And before joining the center, Dr. Tu was assistant professor of EU and comparative constitutional law at the Faculty of Law at Maastricht University in the Netherlands. Then Dr. Christian Odendaal, European economics editor at The Economist. And you joined The Economist, who's here with me on the stage. You joined The Economist in 2022. You're the European economics editor covering Europe's economic integration, monetary and fiscal policies, and broader economic trends. And before joining The Economist, Christian was chief economist at the Centre for European Reform, Britain's European think tank. And then also online, Dr. Nikolai von Ondarza, associate fellow with the Europe program at Chatham House, as well as head of EU-Europe Research Division at the German Institute for International and Security Affairs in Berlin. His research focuses on Germany's role in Europe, EU policies and institutions, EU-UK relations, as well as democracy in Europe. And he's advised the German government and EU institutions on various policy fields. So that's enough from me. Now jumping straight into the questions, and I'm starting with you, Christian. So could you share with us maybe some of your initial reflections on the election results? And we also may be interested to hear what has been the responses from the business community that might give an indication what a CDU-led government might mean for the economy.
Sure. Shall we briefly repeat what the election result was?
Right, yes.
Because I remember you wrote down the numbers.
No, I did write down, in case we haven't been able to look at the results. So the CDU, the Christian Democrats, achieved 28.5%, which is lower than the 30% they were aiming for. The AfD, Alternative for Germany, second strongest party, 20.8%. So that's the strongest result for that party in the history. And the Social Democrats, SPD, only came to 16.4%, which is the weakest result in their history. Then the two parties on the left, the Greens, 11.6%, and Die Linke, the left, 8.8%. So that means there are 5 parties in the new Bundestag. The Liberal Democrats didn't pass the 5%, so they're not represented in the Bundestag this time. And the Bündnis Sarah Wagenknecht, which is a new party that was founded last year, also just missed the 5%. So that's the current situation. And voter turnout was very high this time, 83% around that time. So, okay, over to you.
Yeah, 83% is a big jump. So it shows how much this election mattered to the German voters as well. I guess the first thought was sort of this could have been worse, both in terms of the AfD results. I mean, 20% is terrible, but it still could have been worse given some of the polls. I think that BSW, I mean, that they just missed it by like 13,000 votes or so. I mean, the BSW is sort of a leftist Putin fan club, right? And that they missed it by such a small margin, I think that's just cosmic justice. And then that it is enough for 2 parties to form a government, I think that was important. That was what worried people before the election, because we just had a 3-party government in Germany, which was quarreling most of the time. And so having that experience again, I think was on people's minds, and that it just about was enough for the CDU and the SPD to come together. We call it the Grand Coalition because those used to be our 2 big parties. Given how small it has become, you know, we need another name for this, but it's still sort of the well-experienced pair of parties across the aisle that can work together and have worked together previously. So in that sense, you know, it could have been worse. But then, you know, you think about, well, hold on, this grand coalition of CDU and SPD, weren't those the ones that got us into this mess in the first place? Because they have governed 3 out of 4 terms of Angela Merkel and are largely responsible for the mess that Germany is in, right? So it's geopolitical naivety, it's lack of security investment, it's lack of investment in, frankly, anything. It's lack of economic reform, which now, you know, is tasked with, this government is tasked with, and so forth. So the second thought as well, hold on, we are giving sort of the power back to those who didn't prepare Germany well for the future. I think it's worth pointing out, particularly in Britain, that the conservatives in Germany do not have a track record of reform at all, right? So it's not like Thatcher or Reagan in the US or so. I would go as far as to say that the CDU has not done a meaningful economic reform in Germany since the 1960s, right? And so they have to prove now that they can actually reform the country quite substantially. The Social Democrats have a bit of experience with reform, but not necessarily a positive one when it comes to the electoral result, because they got punished at the voting booth for precisely that. And so if you look at their election manifesto, it doesn't exactly scream sort of reform and future, right? It screams more, we need to protect the voters that we still have, right? So these 2 parties together are now tasked with basically transforming Germany, right? So this is sort of, that's a second thought. And the third is, I don't think this election campaign prepared the German voters for what is about to hit them, right? So if you look at the period of this previous government, which started off as a reformist coalition, but then quickly got upended because of the war and the energy crisis and inflation and so forth. And the election campaign was largely about migration because the AfD, our far-right party, wanted it to be about migration, and the CDU foolishly followed them. So it was, electoral debates before on TV and so forth. It just wouldn't stop. The journalists would always ask about migration, the parties would always answer about migration, and then 45 minutes in, suddenly they started to talk about something else. But you could tell when there were voters in the audience, like your BBC Question Time, and they got to ask the question, almost none of the questions were about migration, right? So there was a detachment between sort of what, the slightly excitable electoral debate wanted to talk about, namely migration, and sort of the real issues facing Germany. And so the country is not prepared, and so this coalition is also not prepared for what it has to do, right? Take the debt brake, we'll talk about this maybe a bit later, but this is one instance where, during the election campaign, the CDU would still say, well, no, we still want to keep that. And literally 24 hours after the result, realize, hold on, we have to spend a lot of money to modernize the country, something we have failed for 16 years to do, so we needed to do it now. And this, likewise, the Social Democrats, while in government trying to defend their record as much as they could, but doing a slightly better job of preparing the country for the future because they had to talk about these issues. But I feel there is not this new coalition does not have a program yet, does not have a narrative yet, and hasn't prepared the country for what is about to come. And we're now after the election, everybody's sort of relieved a bit that this is over, that there's a two-party government. But give it a year or two, and they will immediately think about the next election, and they will think about the threats from the AfD, in case of the CDU, or the threat from the left party, which did amazingly well with almost 9%, or the BSW for the SPD. So I don't expect them to be the reformist coalition that Germany needs.
Okay, great. Yeah, thank you, Christian. So stability, but not necessarily reform. And yeah, okay, great. Then, Tu, over to you. Can you share some of your initial thoughts on the election, and maybe also based on your work you're doing around the EU institutions? Are you seeing any potential major policy shifts that will occur that have impacts on European Union cohesion or the institutions or decision-making processes within the European Union?
Mm-hmm. Yes, thank you for having me. Essentially, I can just fully agree with what Christian said about the elections. I think the overall feeling was really a feeling of it could have been worse. It could have been better, but most generally, it could have been worse. The two-party coalition was what everyone was hoping for. To have to say the fact alone that everyone was hoping for a grand coalition also says a lot about what was expected of these elections in general. It is not the most exciting coalition you can think of, but at least everyone hopes it to provide some stability. And I would say, even though the CDU-CSU won the elections in terms of being the strongest party, I think the real winners were the AfD and the left. And Christian has mentioned this. The AfD has the strongest result it has ever had. It doubled its votes from last time. Could have been worse. I think they were expecting perhaps 22-25%, but 20% is enormous for them. And of course, they have also shortly before the elections the opportunity to in fact become one of the parties on which the CDU also relied on for majority. So they have before the elections also sort of moved into this space where suddenly they could be part of a majority in parliament, which before was unthinkable. And the left were just sensational. I think everyone or a lot of people had written them off before the elections. They were aiming for maybe 3 districts, hopefully 5%. They made 9%, 6 districts. They were the strongest party in Berlin and also among young voters. And I think this is amazing. If you look at young voters' results, the strongest party is the left. And then just shortly after, 21%. I think the left has 23 or 24% among young voters. And then the AfD, 21%. So you also see that really young voters between 18 and 24 are not voting for the mainstream parties anymore, right? They don't vote only for the far right, but they clearly have a preference for the more fringe parties. And I think this is also something that sort of needs to be reflected upon by CDU, SPD, and Greens in the next elections. And I agree with Christian that the electoral campaigns were very disappointing, both in terms of future orientation. And I understand why maybe young voters are not very drawn to the centrist parties, because they offered them very little. And I agree that I think the campaigns failed to convey to the voters in the country what kind of problems are coming up in the next few years. And I think in that sense, it was a missed opportunity. What do I expect for EU policy with the new government? I think two things. Friedrich Merz has very much campaigned on him being different than the previous government, and even different than Merkel being a real European leader. So I think he has the intention to take on leadership in the EU, and he wants to transform Germany's role in the EU. He wants Germany to take a bigger role, to have less infighting, less of abstention because they cannot agree on things. He wants to streamline EU policy in Germany better with him at the helm. I think we will have to see whether that works. I mean, the famous German vote has not only existed under the traffic light coalition. This is simply something that is born out of the political system of Germany between the ministries and the different parties. So I think we'll have to see, because of course leadership is not only about what he wants to do, but it's also about whether he can form the coalitions and the compromises to do it. And the second interesting thing to watch, I think, is how the interplay between Friedrich Merz, so the CDU leader in Germany, will be with Ursula von der Leyen, the Commission president who hails from the same party, and Manfred Weber, the party and group leader of the biggest party in parliament. So they're all three German conservatives. And Merz has said that he wants to use the majority, the EPP majority in the European Council, to also sort of enforce or implement his own visions. And we've seen this in January already, when EPP leaders came to Berlin to also support him in the campaigns. At the same time, I'm not sure whether he necessarily agrees on everything that Ursula von der Leyen, for example, would like to do. And I think the Green Deal and the question how much of a rollback will we see on the European Green Deal will be one of the issues to watch. But it is, of course, an interesting dynamic that might evolve between these three institutions and the three German conservatives. And I think maybe I leave it at that for now.
Okay, great. Thank you, Tu. Yeah, definitely a space to watch the dynamics between Ursula von der Leyen, Friedrich Merz, and you mentioned also the Green Deal. This is also something from, let's say, an environmental perspective that people are concerned about. But you mentioned the real winner was the AfD. And maybe over to Nikolai, let's dig into this a little bit deeper. Can you share some of your thoughts on this, the rise of the AfD? What are the future challenges that will bring to Friedrich Merz's government, and what are maybe wider implications also for the far-right movement across Europe?
Yeah, so thank you very much for having us. And I think, as somebody who believes in a liberal democratic Germany, I think the scale of the win of the AfD was really hard to see. And I think just to put it a little bit into perspective, a couple of points are important for me. First, they didn't win by becoming more moderate, they won by becoming more radical. And this is a difference to many other European far-right parties like Le Pen or the Finnish, the Swedish Democrats and so on, who try to at least give themselves a more moderate picture and image in the public, whereas the AfD over the course of the last 12 years with every iteration has become more radical. And they were also quite radical in their party program on migration, no longer hiding this remigration idea, on proposing to leave the European Union, on very close relationship to Putin's Russia. And I think that they, with this radical program, got 10 million votes, doubled their vote share, won almost every constituency in Eastern Germany, and some of them above 50%. I think this is saying quite something. The second point that I would add to what has already been said is that the election campaign really favored them. Christian already mentioned the focus on migration. I would disagree a little bit with him that this was not the choice by the other parties. I think Friedrich Merz originally wanted to focus on economic policy, but we had the series of atrocious terror attacks in Germany on sort of people on the streets, on kids and so on. You will have seen them. And that really sort of swung the electoral debate on migration. And I think only then came the added strategy of the CDU-CSU to really double down on this issue, copy some of the AfD programs, and I think that added to their benefit. The third point about the campaign that has not yet been mentioned, that I think has not been electorally important, but is important for the German political class, has been the interventions from the US, from Elon Musk, from J.D. Vance in Munich. I think it was interesting that Friedrich Merz, after the election, not only said that these interventions were outrageous, but on the level coming from Moscow, and really putting the interventions from the US on the same level to those of Putin is saying quite something. And I think the anger in mainstream political Germany about these interventions is quite strong. Now, looking forward, what will the effects be? I'm fairly confident that despite the flirt with the AfD during the frantic phase of the election campaign, where Friedrich Merz was willing to at least accept their votes for an issue of migration in the Bundestag, the CDU and Merz himself are crystal clear that they will not go into coalition with the AfD. They are not even having talks with them. And so this sort of now widely discussed firewall, a Brandmauer in German, I think this will hold for this legislative period, and the coalition talks with the SPD might be bumpy. You will hear some threats, but I think at the end of the day, those two parties will hang together. That being said, you can already see the strategy of the AfD. They are saying in public Friedrich Merz will only be able to pursue his program of reform if he works together with the AfD and if he works with the left, and they lump everything from the SPD to the Greens and to the left together in this, then this reform will fail, and they will make poisoned offers. So they will make offers in the Bundestag to vote together with the CDU on issues where the differences with the SPD are particularly strong. For instance, on migration, but also on economic policy, on taxation, on getting rid of some of the green regulations. And so I think the pressure on the government will be continuous throughout this whole coming electoral period. And we don't know what will happen, both on the regional level, but also geopolitically. But I think it's not like the past grand coalitions where Angela Merkel always had big majorities. I think Friedrich Merz will have to constantly fight for the coherence of a coalition he builds. And maybe the last point, and this is also where I disagree slightly with Christian, many in the CDU now speak of a government of last chance. And they say if they do not get this right this time, then the next time the AfD will be the biggest party and potentially form the government. And I think, therefore, the willingness to reform will be bigger in this coalition than it has been in any of the Angela Merkel grand coalitions. Whether they actually be successful in that is an open question, but certainly the political pressure to move and be, for lack of a better word, a bigger driver, a radical driver of change is much bigger this time than in the past years.
Yeah, thank you, Nikolai, for the explanation. Also for mentioning US interference or US support for the AfD. And we'll come back to what the Germany-US relationship might develop towards in a bit. But first of all, back to Christian, to you. Let's talk a bit more about the economy. What's your take on whether Friedrich Merz will be able to kickstart the economy, get the country out of recession, reboost the manufacturing sector? And I wanted to add another angle to this, as well as the issue of like green technologies, future industries.
Right.
How will this, where Germany has a leadership role, where do you see this going?
Yeah, so I think the German economy has been in trouble since about 2018. That was sort of the end point of Germany's manufacturing boom, of the golden decade, if you want. It was a bit unnoticed, I guess, because it was, maybe seen as something temporary. Then came COVID, and then came the energy crisis and so forth. So this has been ongoing for a while. And of course, German businesses during that time did not sit on the hands, but try to explore new technologies, new markets, and so forth. So this adjustment of the German economy underneath the surface has been going on for about 7 years now. And in that sense, some of the work has already been done. So you can see that services sectors are growing, you can see that green technologies are growing, you can see defense and aerospace now, where Germany is relatively strong, booming. And so there are, moves out of traditional sectors that we associate with Germany, steel, chemicals, cars, and so forth. They are in trouble in part because of high energy prices as a result of the Ukraine war. And it is let's say, there is an element of sort of managed decline, right? So this has happened to other parts of German businesses before, where the competitive threat from outside was too large and the German economy readjusted. And there is, to that extent, not that much that policymakers can do there, right? Except for helping to manage that transition. Ideally, not just to sort of plug holes later, but sort of actively try to work with regions where some of these suppliers and firms are concentrated to build out different business models and so forth. The energy shock, of course, was a big one, which came at a time where the German economy was already struggling. So even without the energy shock, right, the German economy was going through a bad patch. But as you mentioned, sort of the green transition. I mean, this is something where Germany has made decisions decades ago of how it wants to transform its energy system, and suddenly one part of it broke away, which was sort of the transition period with cheap gas. And now, of course, the pressure is on any government to make more progress on the green transition, on the grid build-out, on hydrogen and so forth. And I think there the parties largely agree that this needs to be quicker. So in 2022, for example, not just the traffic light government, where the Greens were part of, but also all the state governments, where the CDU was present, agreed on a big package of deregulation of planning rules and so forth to speed up the green transition. At the same time, though, Germany was never really the most progressive in climate policy in Europe, but I think now it's not going to be progressive at all, because it has seen sort of the potential dangers for its industry from a green transition that goes slightly off course, not because of the green transition per se, but because of other policies that affect energy prices and so forth. And so I would expect this government to be very careful on the green transition going forward, and being hesitant to implement anything that may hurt its industry going forward. So this is a bit of a danger. The good thing, of course, is that most of the big things in terms of the green transition in Europe have already been set on track, and in part is already legislated. So it's but you will see the sort of the pushback against the end of the combustion engine, for example, right? This is, how can I put this politely, is a populist take on sort of the green transition in the car industry. And the CDU has been vocal on sort of wanting to delay this, even though the German car industry is not necessarily in favor of this themselves, right? When it comes to tariffs on Chinese EVs, the German government is hesitant because of its overall trade openness, but is aware that, of course, the Chinese EV production is a threat to the German economy. And so I think there will be a very sort of careful approach of trying to manage this industrial reorganization, which is happening since 2018, to manage this further and to, at best, avoid anything that could add to the pressure on businesses. And one of the things, of course, is a massive boost to domestic investment, right? Which could also be a demand push for German firms. And there, of course, German Germany's own fiscal straitjacket, which we call the debt brake, right, which was introduced in 2009, is a problem. And as we speak, sort of the parties are scrambling to fix it before this old parliament has to dissolve, because the new parliament, the main parties, the Greens, the Social Democrats, and the Christian Democrats, do not have a 2/3 majority, and so they cannot change the constitution anymore. And that has changed how Germans think about the constitution quite fundamentally. Because previously, the Grand Coalition, you could always count on until 2021, since the Second World War, the two main parties always had a constitutional majority. So basically, whatever you put into the constitution was not meant to be in there forever, but it was meant as let's put that in there so we can only change it if we both agree. It was basically a Grand Coalition proviso and not sort of meant as something permanent. And now they realize not only does the Grand Coalition no longer have a 2/3 majority, but not even including the Greens. And so now they are quite a bit more urgently trying to find a way to fix this. And my expectation is that they will fix this in the next couple of days or weeks to make sure that this old parliament, where they still have a 2/3 majority, can change the constitution quickly before the new parliament takes over. This is something which is unprecedented, which is, in terms of democratic and legal understanding of how this is supposed to work, unorthodox, to put it mildly, right? But the situation is so dire, also in terms of defense, that even the CDU said, okay, we can't have this anymore. The question, of course, is how will this now be implemented in practice, right? The CDU will probably push for a one-off, I don't know, defense fund or whatever. And the Greens and the Social Democrats will make pretty clear that they will need fully fledged reform of that straitjacket because it just doesn't fit to the new challenges that Germany faces.
Yeah, no, thank you, Christian. The explanation on the debt brake. So that's definitely a space to watch over the next few weeks. And it also leads us to the next topic that we would like to hear a bit more about. You partly mentioned it, is defense spending, Ukraine. Too, I was wondering if you could, because debt brake reform will be necessary to achieve that spending on defense, as it's being discussed. So, could you explain a bit more how you see now Germany's foreign and security policy evolve in relation to Ukraine, but maybe also then looking again at the German-US relationship?
Yes, can I just like to add two things perhaps on what Christian said and what Nikolai said on the debt brake reform. I think this will be very, very interesting to watch. I think unorthodox describes it perhaps very mildly. And I think it's important to say that this is not the only choice, right? There is the left, so differently. CDU, SD, and Greens need the left to reform the debt brake. The left is not opposed to reforming the debt brake. They want the debt brake reform for different purposes. They want more investment in infrastructure and social policies. In climate, they're opposed to more spending for military, for the Bundeswehr. The CDU wants the opposite, basically. So I think there's the question of, do you try to get a compromise in the new parliament that has just been elected? Might be possible, but would be very, very difficult. Or do you try to circumvent that difficulty by trying to introduce the reform with the old parliament after the election, after actually you've had the opportunity to do this before the elections also, right? The CDU was in parliament. There was a majority before the elections to do this. They didn't want to do it. A side comment on that. And the other comment on what Nikolai said about liberal democracy in Germany and the EU. And what worries me a bit there is absolutely what Nikolai said about the question of the firewall, of the AfD, but this whole situation that we had before the elections on the migration question and voting with the AfD was also that what was voted, so the content of the package that was voted was in breach of European law. And there was this apparent instinct by the conservatives to say, this is so important to us. And I hope this was electoral campaign related in the heat of the campaigns. But there was a tendency to say, we want to do this. We want to do this on migration. European law does not allow us to do it. We don't care. We'd rather do it in breach of EU law because this is so important. Of course, that is not how EU law works. Their argument was, that the rules don't work, other member states do not adhere to the rules, so we do not have to adhere to it either. And again, I think this was an exception, but once Germany starts to consider European law, international law, any kind of law really, to be optional in case that it does not suit them, I think that becomes very, very, very dangerous, not just for Germany, but for Europe as a whole, because it makes a difference. It is different whether it is Germany that considers EU law to be less binding, or if it is Hungary. And again, I hope this was exceptional, but I think it was an episode that worried a lot of people from a European law perspective, and worried me a lot. And I hope that this is not something that we will see more often. But I agree with Nikolai that the pressure coming from the AfD and from the right will be immense on the CDU, and I hope that they can sort of withhold that pressure. No, that's not the right word, but withstand the pressure. On policy shifts, on foreign and security issues, I think one of the biggest questions will be defense spending. And I think this is also one of the questions that the campaign simply failed to prepare the voters on, that this will be a big question. And that there is, of course, a question of whether it really is possible to ramp up defense spending as much without it being felt by the population on anything else. And the question of the debt brake reform is, I think, now the most urgent one, as we've also seen in the debates in Germany. And I think this is why they're trying to move so quickly within the next 30 days. Overall, I think Merz has always been quite a transatlanticist. So he has been very much a supporter of a good relationship with the US. We've seen this change very recently after the election. He said that Europe needs to prepare to become independent from the US in case that the US withdraws from NATO. I think now we have to see what that really means. I think it relates to the question of ramping up defense spending and the debt brake. On China, he's, I think, been a bit more hawkish than the last government. So he also sees the need, or he has expressed the need for Europe to also become more independent. At the same time, I think there is this instinct also of Germany first, or German interests first in the CDU. So we'll have to see whether they would, for example, vote for European tariffs against China. The last government did not. Where we will see a difference, I think, is sort of in the rhetorics and how the next chancellor, or I mean, if he becomes chancellor, but the next chancellor sort of talks about security and defense, right? So we will see a shift away from this peace chancellor campaign that Scholz very much had. So he campaigned as the Friedenskanzler. So there was a much more cautious approach, and I think this we will not see from Merz. So there will be very, very much a difference in how he will talk about security, talk about foreign policy, and talk about support in Ukraine. Nonetheless, of course, he will have to work in a coalition with the SPD, and there it is. To me, it's a little bit unclear how much of the party of the SPD follows Scholz's more cautious approach, and how much of the party does not. I think the very popular defense minister Boris Pistorius is much less cautious than Scholz, for example. So I think there is also some space for the SPD to move, but of course this is also an area where Merz as a chancellor can make quite a difference simply in how the government itself approaches the question. So I think this is definitely an area where we will see a difference.
Okay, great. Thank you, too. We're almost to the Q&A, so if you already have some questions, get ready to raise your hands. But one last question to Nikolai, and I think we wanted to ask a question how the UK-Germany relationship might develop. Will there be more partnerships? What are cooperation opportunities under the new CDU-led government?
Yeah, so to be frank, the relationship with the UK is not on the top of people's minds in Berlin after the election, but I would say there's generally a goodwill to deepen the relationship. You might know that the last government was working together with the UK on a friendship treaty. They already signed the so-called Trinity House Agreement on deeper defense cooperation. This was more the political agreement, and then they plan to, before the government collapsed, they plan to have a treaty agreed by Christmas. And as far as we know from the public, most of their treaty is basically ready to be signed. And there's a clear intention also from the CDU to progress on that. And so I would expect this treaty to come back to the agenda when the government is formed. And I'm quite confident that it will be signed if both sides are willing this year. I think the more interesting question is about the European security architecture. Friedrich Merz is often speaking about the idea of a sort of Ukraine contract group of Germany, France, Poland, Italy, Spain, plus the United Kingdom. So this idea to involve the UK very strongly in European security, and all of the sort of emergency summit, emergency trips to the US that Macron and Starmer are doing. I think here is something where Friedrich Merz will be very interested to keep working with the UK, and also find a way for the UK to keep working with the EU on security. And so I think the goodwill is there. However, maybe last sentence on that, the fundamental position, I think, has not changed from the German government, that it's interested also in areas like youth mobility in the EU-UK relationship, and that for closer economic partnership, there also needs to be movement from the UK on its red line. So I think the economic position has not changed. On security and defense, I think there's more openness to work together on an EU level, and then thirdly, the ambition for the bilateral treaty.
Okay, fantastic. Yeah, thank you, Nikolai. And then, yes, now over to you, please. You can raise your hand, and then please state your name and your affiliation, and the microphone will come to you. Who's got a question? Yes, over here. Okay, start.
Hello, good morning. My name's Sophia O'Brien. I'm a master's student at the War Studies Department at King's College. My question is back to, we were talking a little bit about the transatlantic relationship, and I was surprised to see Friedrich Merz in some of his first public statements talking about a shift in almost like a decoupling from the United States. I was just wondering, in your opinion, what that could look like. Like, is this just rhetoric, or could we see concrete steps towards that, and what would that look like? What should we be looking for? Thanks.
Okay, thank you for the question. Any other question? Right, yeah, the gentleman just there.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Ewan Grant, UK Defence Forum, although my question reflects personal views. I worked in Ukraine several times on European Commission programmes. I saw the dark side of the Commission there. They made very, very major mistakes, which are extremely costly. How do you see, following on from the lady's point, cooperation by Germany, perhaps with the UK membership of the JEF, the Joint Expeditionary Force, to tidy up and tighten up defence and security in order to assist Ukraine and assist Europe? Beyond pious words, to practical nitty-gritty cooperation, particularly in intelligence and surveillance, because, of course, we're still heavily dependent on the US there.
Great, thank you. Maybe one more question over there, and then we do a round of responses.
Thank you. Neil Skinner for Fiducium. Just a question on the European political union that was very driven by Emmanuel Macron. I just appreciate some views on Germany's attitude towards that, and whether it's something they want to actively participate in or not. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, should we start? No? Okay, so we have 3 questions. One on potential US-Germany decoupling, closer UK, or like Germany, UK cooperation in Ukraine on security issues, and then German perspectives on the EU political union. I think maybe 2. Do you want to get started? No? No? Hard questions.
Okay,
right.
I can start with the transatlantic, at least as
okay.
regards the economic side. So Friedrich Merz's comments, I think, largely reflect sort of a realization in Germany that this protective relationship between Germany and the US is in serious trouble. And it is still, I was probably as surprised as you were, that this is something that he chooses to say less than a few hours after the election results came out, before he has agreed a coalition agreement, before he had formal summits with major European partners, because it seems to be a very decisive shift in 80 years of German foreign policy, right? My sense is that reflects more on Merz as a politician than it reflects on sort of that Germany is ready to make that shift properly, because he has a history of, you know, going out there with ideas that he hasn't fully war-gamed, let's say that. I think for Germany, the relationship is particularly tricky to manage because Germany depends on a global trade order, which the US protected, because Germany has economic interests in countries that the current US administration considers adversaries. And so the pressure on managing that relationship is probably the single most difficult issue for any German government. And so I was surprised as you that he would basically do a policy announcement sort of in a talk show, right? So that it's more like something you would announce at a Chatham House speech, right? So
we'll get him here for his next statement, maybe.
Yeah. There you go.
Okay, then great. Maybe then over to Nikolai. Do you want to take any of the other 2?
Yeah, maybe to add a couple of thoughts. First, on Ukraine and cooperation with the UK and the Joint Expeditionary Force, I think it's fair to say that Merz's position on the Ukraine war is closer to the UK's position than the last chancellor's was. And so there's willingness to cooperate deeper. But the question is how quickly that can become a reality and how far that will go. I think we haven't yet mentioned the fact that, at least for a UK audience, it's important to know that these coalition talks take a long time. So the last grand coalitions all took over 70 days to negotiate. There's usually a scoping phase, then there's real coalition talks on a 100+ pages document, and then there's internal party ratification, sometimes with a members vote. And so even if Merz now says he wants an agreement by Easter, I think that would be very quick for German standards. So don't be surprised if Germany doesn't have a full functioning government until May or even June. And that means by that time, a lot of core decisions on Ukraine will have been taken. And this is quite hard for Germany. What role will Olaf Scholz now play, for instance, at the emergency summit of the European Council next week? What role will he play in negotiations with Macron, Starmer, and so on? And Merz will be in contact with them. He has, for instance, talked with Macron on the phone before he traveled to Washington, but he obviously can't play that strong role yet. And so I think there will be a careful managing. And the second point is I wouldn't overestimate the complete switch. So there are still constraints on Merz. So for instance, if we are now talking seriously about a deployment of European troops in Ukraine, this is something that would need the vote of the Bundestag with a very strict mandate usually, and a much more difficult discussion in Germany than is likely to happen in the UK or France. And so I would more think that we see a gradual change here for Merz than a radical one. Maybe specifically on the Joint Expeditionary Force, I don't think Germany is on the verge of joining that format, but they're certainly thinking about sort of closer cooperation, specifically with the Nordic and Baltic countries. And this is an area where UK-German security defense cooperation could come into play. Finally, on the European political community, in Berlin, you actually only ever hear it mentioned either by French or Brits. And the German government has never really found the big use for the format. So the chancellor, you hear, likes it for bilateral and meetings with other heads of states and government, but that is often done over the European Union and NATO and so on. Anyway, so the format is less useful for a German chancellor than, let's say, for the UK. And then there was also always skepticism in Berlin whether it's really an alternative to enlargement or to the Council of Europe and what it would actually achieve. And so I don't think this will change with the next government. So if there is an upcoming summit from the European political community, Merz will go there and have the meetings and engage in the format, but it's not something that Germany is really strongly pushing for. I think there you will see more movement of Merz has also been a supporter of enlargement of the Western Balkans. And Ursula von der Leyen has yesterday, and this is another statement that made me curious, said that she believes Ukraine enlargement could be possible before 2030. And I would imagine they're much more sort of wrangling in Berlin whether and how that is actually possible and how to deal with Ukraine on all these different strands than much enthusiasm for the European political community.
Thank you, Nikolai. There's one point you made about the length it normally takes to put together a coalition agreement. There's something interesting I picked up, again, in a talk show. It seems a lot of politics is now made in German talk shows, but there was discussion about having like a 10-point plan for the next year with action points that could be agreed on very quickly. And then we would have a new coalition by Easter. So that could be some interesting innovation, but remains to be seen. But, Tu, did you want to add any of this?
No, I think this is the big discussion now also in terms of how detailed should the coalition agreement be, and can we also perhaps make yearly coalition agreements. And I think this also draws a bit from the experience of the last coalition agreement, which was very detailed, took a very long time, and then the Ukraine war started, and basically everything had to be thrown over and renegotiated, or it didn't matter so much anymore. So I think there are thoughts and discussions considering the urgency of the situation globally, whether it would make sense to sort of move a bit away from very detailed agreements and now get the government in place quickly. Perhaps one aspect to watch on this is that the SPD will in all likelihood put any coalition agreement to a vote to its members. Right. This not only will take some time. So if Merz really wants the government by Easter, this coalition agreement has to stand by March. But the danger is, of course, if the agreement looks in a way that the SPD members do not agree to it, because traditionally also there have not been huge fans of grand coalitions because it doesn't help them very much afterwards. We don't really have an alternative. Right, so this is actually a coalition and a coalition agreement that needs to stand and that needs to be approved by SPD members. Otherwise, we will be here after Easter with no government alternative, and I think that would be the worst case. So there is this balancing of how detailed, how fast, but also how acceptable will it be.
Okay, yeah, thank you. There's quite a few questions online, actually quite a few questions around the AfD, so maybe we can have some more, like another round of comments on that. People, there's one question, how now the AfD looks at itself established as a mainstream party. We might see some transformation of the AfD similar to what we've seen in Italy. There's also some questions relating again about the split between East and West Germany in terms of AfD voting. So then question about the firewall. Will the firewall drive voters away from or towards the AfD? So a mix of complicated questions.
So they're too complicated for me. This is something for Nikolai and Tu to answer.
Right. Okay. Over to maybe Nikolai for you. There you go.
Okay, I can try to start. So first, the question whether the AfD could change now that it's a bigger party. I don't see a path to moderation under the current leadership, and because I mean they were successful with their radical program, and they were most successful in Eastern Germany where they are most radical, and so there is no sort of incentive whatsoever for them to become more moderate. And then thirdly, they have established for their voters a kind of alternative media landscape where they dominate the narrative and where they reach these voters with a different narratives that I don't see the incentive for them to become more moderate. And of course, there is a discussion to be had about the firewall and the Brandmauer or cordon sanitaire, how it's often said in European discussions, whether if you now allow the AfD to become part of regional governments or something like that, whether that would make them more moderate. I personally think they have become so radical that in their current state, that would be a danger to German democracy and would speak highly against that. But there's no doubt that this allows them to be everything to everybody without paying any kind of electoral costs for that. So for instance, they are now the strongest party amongst sort of old workers. So what used to be the SPD sort of electoral group, but their party program economically is highly to the benefit of rich people. And so if they actually would implement their program, it would be to the detriment of most of their voters, but they can just promise everything to everybody in the most radical way because they know they don't have to take any responsibility. But ultimately, I think as long as they are so radical, I personally would be highly skeptical of any attempts to include them into even regional government in Germany. But it's hard to see that firewall completely holding if they rise further in the polls during the next legislature, which is not unlikely to happen. Let's put it this way.
Okay, thank you, Nikolai. We're almost up to the time. Maybe some concluding remarks from you, Christian, or Tu? Anything that we haven't touched upon?
No, I mean, what Nikolai said just now there, that the AfD may still have more potential to rise further. Maybe this speaks sort of to the initial disagreement that Nikolai and I had, sort of whether this coalition, because there is so much pressure to solve really big issues for Germany at the moment, so the breakdown of the global order on which Germany of all countries in the world probably depended the most. To mention just one, there are many on the economic side as well. Whether that pressure leads this government to become a bold reformist coalition, or whether on the other side of the spectrum, sort of this coalition, 1 year in, having to implement tough reforms, having to implement spending cuts, because not all of that can be debt funded, right? Having to manage a decline, a partial industrial decline over the next couple of years while the economy restructures, and then seeing sort of the BSW rise in the polls again, AfD rise in the polls, the temptation then to make migration again a topic and so forth. So there is a danger that this coalition sort of starts off trying to tackle the big issues and then get sidetracked because the polls are terrible, and then they lose their compass. And so I'm slightly more worried, I guess, than Nikolai that this may yet happen, which is why I'm a bit hesitant to be very optimistic, because the task for this next government is enormous.
Okay, thank you. And Tu, any final words?
I mean, I fully agree with Christian. I think Friedrich Merz also actually sort of started this campaign with the thought that he needs to contain the AfD, right? So Germany, or parts of Germany, or parts of the CDU is looking at 2029, as Macron has been looking at 2027. So the way that Macron wanted to stop Le Pen from coming into office in 2027 is sort of how the CDU and Merz look at 2029 when it comes to the AfD, that they need to stop the rise of the AfD within this legislative term. Otherwise, it will be too late. I think there are divergent views on how this is better approached, whether there's a necessity to become stronger on migration, on issues on which the AfD is strong, or whether there's a need to really distance yourself from far-right positions. And I think this is also something that will be sort of has to be figured out in the next years. But I'm also quite worried. I'm also worried with regard to the Länder and the regions, right? The AfD is, as Nicolas said, very strong in especially East Germany. And I think it will be very difficult for the CDU at federal level to contain a regional CDU if they really want to enter into government with the AfD, especially after they have voted with the AfD. So we'll have to see, and I think really just hope that Merz's strategy to contain the AfD by 2029 works out, not just for Germany, but I think also for Europe, because I think it is very important that liberal democracy in Germany holds up, especially now and in the next years.
Yeah, thank you, too. I mean, yeah, it's good to close on these words of caution. So slight optimism, but still very cautious on what will happen. So we're at the hour. Let us together thank our panelists. It was a great discussion. Thank you for joining today. And, please.